In the previous episode, we looked at what Christians were saying about Jesus, but what did non-Christians have to say about this Jewish carpenter and his followers? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this episode. Let's get started. Jesus himself was a Jew, and his early followers were Jews. But most Jews did not accept his message. And the first big Jewish writer to write about Jesus who wasn't a Christian was Flavius Josephus, whom I made a video about, which you can check in the eye in the upper right-hand corner. Sometime after the first Jewish revolt, Josephus wrote a history of the Jews for his Roman patrons titled The Antiquities of the Jews. In that book, Josephus references Jesus twice. The first reference occurs in Book 18, in a passage commonly referred to as the Testimonium Flavium, or the Testimony of Flavius Josephus. The text refers to Jesus like this: Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He was the Christ, and when Pilate had condemned him to the cross, he appeared to them alive again the third day. This particular passage is quite controversial, and it's a point of focus for mythicists trying to discredit the historicity of Jesus. As mentioned in my video about Flavius Josephus, Josephus was an Orthodox practicing Jew for his whole life, and this passage says some things about Jesus that someone who was not a worshiper of him would not have said. He would not have referred to Jesus as Christ, or admitted that he had come back to life after the crucifixion. I don't want to go too deep into this particular issue right now because I'm going to have a video later dedicated to it. But suffice it to say that although most historians believe that this passage was altered by Christian scribes at some point, they don't believe it is a forgery in its entirety like the mythicists usually do. The second reference to Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews is believed by most historians to be legitimate, and it comes in Book 20 when Josephus says, He assembled a council of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James. In this passage, Josephus was referring to James, who was Jesus' brother by way of Joseph and Mary. As you can probably tell, this passage is far less controversial because he refers to Jesus as the so-called Christ rather than as Christ. This less flattering description leads scholars to believe that this passage has remained unedited, and it also leads them to believe that the reference in Book 18, although it has been edited, believes that there was a reference to Jesus in it, because why would you reference someone in a later book as the brother of Jesus if that's going to be the first time you're bringing this person up at all? However, mythicists find problem with this as well, and so we will discuss that in a later dedicated episode. There are also references to Jesus in the Talmud, or at least references that might be made to Jesus. In Sanhedrin 43a it says, On the eve of Passover they hung Yeshu, and the crier went forth for 40 days beforehand, declaring that Yeshu is going to be stoned for practicing witchcraft, for enticing and leading Israel astray. Anyone who knows something to clear him should come forth and exonerate him. But no one had anything exonerating for him, and they hung him on the eve of Passover. The means of execution may be different, but most of the details seem to be consistent with the traditional narrative, with the main difference being the more negative portrayal of Jesus rather than you see in the Gospels. Of course, the reliability of this text depends heavily upon the time in which it was written. Some believe that the text is from the Tannaitic period of the Talmud, which are documents from the 1st and 2nd century CE. If it was written closer to the mid-1st century, then the text would be fairly reliable as a reflection of what Jews contemporary to Jesus thought of him and his followers. However, if this passage was written closer to the end of the Tannaitic period, it is far less reliable. There's also the possibility that this passage was actually from the Amoritic period, which goes from about 200 to 500 CE, which would make it even less reliable. There are other possible references to Jesus in the Talmud, but most of these are dated far too late to be reliable for any kind of historical portrait of Jesus. Beyond Jewish references, there are also pagan references to Jesus, but similar to some of the Christian references, they come across some of the same problems in terms of dating and reliability. The most frequently cited pagan texts are the Annals from the Roman historian Tacitus. In Book 15 of the Annals, Tacitus references the Christians and the execution of Jesus. Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt and punished Christians, who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. This quote comes from a passage about the fire of Rome during the reign of Tiberius in 64 CE, for which the Christians were fraudulently blamed. Like the reference to Jesus in Book 18 of the Antiquities, mythicists claim that this text has been edited in some way. However, you'd be hard-pressed to find any classicist or Roman historian who believes them. Just like with the issue with Josephus, we are going to have a video later dedicated to this question, and for those of you who keep commenting or messaging me about Richard Carrier, his article on the subject will be addressed in that video, so I ask that you be patient, but I don't know exactly when I'm going to get to it. Tacitus wasn't the only Roman to write about Jesus and the early Christians. We have Pliny the Younger, who was the Roman governor of Bithynia in the early 2nd century CE, and he writes about the Christians and his punishments for them to Emperor Trajan, and how he forced them to curse Christ, which a genuine Christian cannot be induced to do. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt, or their error, was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang an alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to a god. We see another reference to early Christians in Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars. In his writings on the Emperor Claudius, he writes about the expulsion of the Jews from the city of Rome around the year 49 CE. However, Suetonius' wording implies that Jesus, or as the Roman historians tended to call him, Christus, was still alive and actively inciting revolt. Some believe that this means that the Jews were reacting to a different public figure. However, it's just as possible that Suetonius simply didn't have all the information. There is also a possible reference to Jesus in a letter written by the 1st century Stoic philosopher Mara bar Serapion. In this letter, Mara refers to 3 wise men who were unjustly treated by their governments. The first of these men was Socrates, who was poisoned by the city of Athens. The second was Pythagoras, whom I hope to make a video on at some point because this guy was nuts. And the third person he referred to as being the King of the Jews. Most scholars don't doubt that Mara was referring to Jesus. What they do debate over is whether or not Mara himself was actually a Christian or just some kind of pagan monotheist. Now, none of these non-Christian writers knew Jesus personally, but it's very likely that they knew people who knew Jesus or had access to the writings of those who did. The reason many of these writers are important in assessing the historicity of Jesus is that it proves that there were people called Christians in the mid to late 1st century CE who were worshiping Jesus as a god, and that they understood Jesus to have been a living person of flesh and blood at some point. This is important because there are strains of mythicism that believe that the early Christians were not worshiping a flesh and blood Jesus, but rather worshiping some kind of celestial cosmic Jesus. But these documents prove that people were worshiping a flesh and blood person. There are other possible sources, both Christian and non-Christian, that you could look at to create a biography of Jesus, but most of those are dated far too late or are references to Jesus that are far too unclear to be put into this video. However, some of them will be included in later videos as needed. So now that we know what sources are available to create a biography of a historical Jesus, how did we get from pretty much everyone agreeing that yes, he existed, to there being an entire community based around the idea that he didn't exist? Well, we're going to cover that over the next few episodes of this series, where I'll be covering the history of the Christ myth theory from its origins to its current incarnation. I would like to thank my patrons for helping me make this video, especially my executive producer, Leo Hawkhauser. Thanks to your support, I can continue to make these videos for people to learn from and enjoy. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can go to patreon.com/GrantHurst to find out how. By doing so, you can get special perks such as having your name at the end of videos, as well as seeing videos early. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.